My next talk is going to be about flight safety, or aviation safety as some people call it, a subject that is very dear to my heart, and should I say dear to anybody who's aircrew. They always have an interest in flight safety. In particular, because some of the jobs that I've held. For example, I was from 1994 to 1997 as an Air Commodore. I was the RAF's Inspector of Flight Safety. I then became a trustee of the Confidential Human Incident Reporting Program, CHIRP, which I've remained a trustee for about 20 years, which has a flight safety connotation to it. I was master of the Honourable Company of Air Pilots, which has a very keen interest in aviation safety. And out of that, in fact, I moved on and I became chairman of the General Aviation Safety Council for 6 years or so. And that I found absolutely fascinating, involved with general aviation mainly. And for the last 30, 40 years, I've had a very close involvement, or longer in fact, close involvement with air displays. And for the last 30 years, really, in the supervision of air displays. So aviation safety, to this day, is dear to my heart. But let me give a bit of background first of all, and I'm going to look specifically at military. We'll start from just after the Second World War, 1946. In 1946, the RAF was a very big air force with a lot of aircraft based all over the world. This is the first peacetime year, and you will be staggered to hear that worldwide the RAF in 1946 lost 1,014 aircraft. 1,014 aircraft. That's, to me, an almost unbelievable statistic. And that included some 776, I think it was, pilots or aircrew killed. The accidents themselves were complete variety. Suffice to say that it was the first year post-war, the Air Force refinding its feet. The types of accidents, that you could almost name it, they were happening all over the place, all the time. There was clearly a need for better control. And in those days, out of that 1,014, some 400 were in the UK itself. Remember, the RAF was very much a global air force. So, really, out of that came aviation safety. Staff were established, and people started taking interest in the safety side as a means of preventing accidents, but they're expensive. You're losing 1,000 aircraft. Just think of the cost of that. So the Air Force couldn't afford it, and so it was important to cut down on these accidents from the cost perspective, from the cost as far as to the government, not to mention the cost to the human side of it. And actually, not the Inspectorate of Flight Safety, but a Flight Safety Department was formed, and the influence became was seen quite quickly. But by the 1950s, the accident rate was still very high. And I'm going to use years here: 1954, 1974, and 1994. In 1954, the RAF was now losing in the order of 300 aircraft per year. Still far too many, and the accident rate was very high. By 1974, and things move on all the time, technology is improving, knowledge is improving, rules and regulations are becoming better, everything's becoming better organised, and really, this is where flight safety played a very major part in reducing the accident rate, through having people who were concentrating on the safety side of things. By 1974, the RAF was losing in the order of 45 aircraft. That's a very significant drop in 20 years, from 300 aircraft a year to 40 to 45 a year. But the accident rate was still far too high. I'm just trying to think in my head now, in terms of number of accidents per 100,000 flying hours, the accident rate was about 0.44, I think it was. And now that might sound to you very low, but believe me, that is very high. And if it's 44, 45 aircraft being lost, and by this stage in the 1970s, the RAF was operating some pretty sophisticated, high performance and expensive aircraft, the cost of these losses really could not be sustained. So we continued improving, and in 1994, which is when I became the RAF's Inspector of Flight Safety, the accident rate had reduced to in the order of about 8 aircraft per year. Again, that's come down from 44 to 8 in a little over 20 years. A significant improvement. The rate itself had halved from 0.44 per 100,000 flying hours to 0.22 per 100,000 flying hours. But I can tell you that sort of in my time as Inspector of Flight Safety, I always said that there were people who said a zero accident rate was impossible to ever achieve. That was not me. My view has always been that a zero accident rate is possible to achieve. You might not achieve it every year, but it is possible to achieve. And there are Air Forces, people around the world who have done it. And actually, these days, it's even safer. More about that in just a moment. But by the 1990s, again, technology had moved forward again. And technology has played a very major part in helping improve the accident rates. Everything has. I mean, when I was Inspector of Flight Safety, for example, I had a staff of about 40 people devoted to looking after aviation safety in all its forms. They played a very critical part in helping keep the accident rate down. That's not to mention all the squadrons, the stations, the groups, the commands, all of which had an interest in aviation safety, all of which had people dealing with it. For example, on the squadrons, would always have a flight safety officer, the stations would have a flight safety officer. Flight safety became an integral part of day-to-day life in the Royal Air Force, and dare I say it, throughout the flying world. Today, 2021, the RAF loses very, very few aircraft indeed. Any aircraft lost, quite frankly, is one too many. And I'll give you an example of the effect of losing aircraft. For example, when I was Director of Eurofighter in the MOD in the late 1990s, this is before we were procuring the Eurofighter Typhoon to take over from the Tornado that I'd introduced. At that stage, we didn't actually get that many, but the government was procuring 232 aircraft. And a Tornado is a very, very expensive aircraft. It's each generated because of the sophistication in it. The aircraft aren't getting cheaper, they're getting more and more expensive. I'm not saying they won't get cheaper in the future. I think they may well through other means. But out of that 232, believe it or not, I think it was something like over 80 aircraft of that 232 were being procured as really replacement aircraft, i.e. in anticipation of losses. Because we used to, for example, if the Tornado, if the Typhoon was coming in for 25 years service, the sort of calculations that were done, well, it's going to be there for 25 years. We've got to anticipate losing 3 aircraft per year. 3 aircraft over 25 years equals 75 aircraft. I'm using this as an example. You procure 75 Typhoons to cover losses, and think of the cost of that. It is really an unacceptable sort of amount of money. Anyway, that didn't happen. The first thing that didn't happen is we didn't procure all those number of attrition aircraft, as we call them. The second thing is that the losses have been, touch wood, very, very low. I don't think almost none. That is how things have changed. I just use all that to give you an example of sort of the cost of accidents and why it's so important to get safety right. Safety is of paramount importance in all our lives, in all respects, and it certainly is in the flying world. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about my time as Inspector of Flight Safety. It was a fantastic job for me. I was an Air Commodore by this point. I thought my flying had come to an end. Initially, first of all, I thought when I had been a squadron commander as a wing commander, I thought my flying had come to an end. But then I got promoted to group captain and became a station commander of a tornado base. And so my flying, I obviously didn't fly as much because I had other responsibilities, but I still did fly 2 or 3 times a week. And so I continued to fly the tornado as a station commander. I then went off, I went to Washington, into the embassy there, came back on promotion to Air Commodore, and I thought my flying again had finished when I was a group captain, but it hadn't, because I got this magnificent job, Inspector of Flight Safety for the Royal Air Force, which, amongst other things, it was I had to stay current. My remit was to stay current on at least one operational aircraft, which, surprise, surprise, was the Tornado, which I knew very well. I also stayed current first pilot on 3 other aircraft. The Hercules. I'm not a multi-engine pilot, but the Hercules, I remember sort of coming back from Washington and being met by the station commander when I arrived at Lynham, and he said, who I knew well, and he said, "Congratulations, Rick, on the new job. Please, one plea from the multi-engine world. And none of your predecessors have shown much interest in the multi-engine world. Please do not ignore us." I made him a promise there and then. I said, "Brian, I will not ignore you." And that is why I did not ignore them. And I wasn't going to ignore them anyway. And I got myself checked out. First pilot on the Hercules, and I used to go down route with the Hercules boys, and I found it very interesting as well. I also stayed current on the Hawk and started current on the Tucano as well. And I flew everything. I flew absolutely everything in that job. In particular, and I had my eyes opened. I had my eyes opened by some of the flying I did with the helicopter people. I had my eyes opened by flying with the Special Forces Hercules at low level at 250 feet at night using night vision goggles. And I had my eyes opened by, in particular, the Nimrod force flying on a dirty dark night out over the sea at ultra low level, shall we say, when it really concentrates the eyes and the mind. All I'll say is, having been a fighter pilot all my life, and most fighter pilots think they're the best, all I'll say is that this showed me there were plenty of other people who were doing equally demanding roles, and probably more demanding. I was really, really impressed. And I also, my other remit in that job was I'm a people person, was to get out there and meet the people so I could keep in touch. So it was a fantastic job. I had a staff back at my headquarters, a staff of about 40. I had a deputy who was a group captain, and he was really sort of the man who sort of ran the office while I was out and about flying and meeting the people and travelling the world, quite frankly, because I also met and went and visited a number of other air forces. And just talking about that, I'd just like to touch 2 places in particular that I went to. India was my visit to India was fascinating, to see how the Indians operate and fly, and just to see India. But the one that really I remember was going to Australia. I went to Australia because the Australians had a number of accidents themselves, and I knew the Australian Inspector of Flight Safety very well, and he'd obviously been speaking to his Chief of the Air Staff, and he came to me and said, "Rick, I think we need you to come out to Australia to have a look at us at the Australian Air Force and just see what's wrong, because we're losing all these aircraft." So next thing happened, an invitation came from Australia, from their Chief of the Air Staff to our Chief of the Air Staff, inviting me to go and do an independent check of the Australian Air Force and to write a report and make recommendations. That's how I went there. That's what I did. I thought it was very brave of the Australians to invite an independent person from another Air Force to come and look at them. Very brave, and I take my hat off to them. And not only did they make me very welcome, but I had a fascinating time there, visiting various places, speaking to people, and working out in my own mind what I thought needed to change. At the end of it all, I wrote a very lengthy report with something like 230 recommendations, I think it was. And I remember, and I presented my report to the Deputy Chief of the Air Staff out there, and the report was accepted in toto and implemented immediately. And the reason why I remember it so well was not just because I thought it was an amazing thing for them to do, but the effect. Because the accident rate as soon as they started implementing my report, the accident rate plummeted and has been basically low ever since. So clearly my input there, in my view, had an effect. So that means quite a lot to me. Back in the UK, there are always things you can improve on in the flight safety world. I found it absolutely fascinating speaking to people. One thing I did find, because I was getting out and about around the Air Force, I knew what people were thinking. I knew where things were wrong. I knew where they were right as well. I had a remit to report directly up the line. I did find myself, sort of very much identifying with those who were below me from that job, because I could really grew to appreciate their problems, and it wasn't always quite as easy getting the message of those problems to be accepted by those above me, who were sometimes incredulous as to that the problems were there, but I knew they were there. I won't tell you some of the discussions I had, but they were quite interesting. And it certainly made a difference to my own mind, as quite frankly, because I ran as inspector, I ran a confidential reporting system known as Condor, where individuals from wherever in the Air Force or outside for that matter could write to me a confidential letter and know that I was the only person who would read that letter. And I used to read it, and the letters were kept under lock and key, only held by me. The names were never divulged. I used to work out how am I going to deal with this one? And the big problem was trying to solve the problem sometimes without disclosing the source of the letter in the first place. But what I will say is that I used to get probably about 25 letters a year, I think it was. They were all fascinating, all very real problems that needed to be dealt with, all problems that I did deal with, and it was and that itself brought to my attention some of the problems that were out there, problems that we were able to solve. And I can honestly say that not one name of anybody who wrote to me was ever disclosed. That happens in the outside world through CHIRP, which I belonged to as well later on. And in fact, while I was Inspector of Flight Safety, I was a member of CHIRP at the time as well. So while I was the RAF's Inspector of Flight Safety, I had some interesting experiences as well. I mean, apart from some of the accidents we had were very sad, and they always are. Accidents are never pleasant. And the unfortunate thing about it is that 60 to 70% of all accidents that happened then and happen now in general, not just in the military but in other organisations as well, relate to human factors. So it's the involvement of the human. And some of these accidents should never have happened. Most, in fact, quite frankly, most of them shouldn't have happened. I was surprised at one of the things that came across me in my time was in the high pressure environment, operational environment in particular, you find very few incidents and accidents taking place. And personally sort of think that is due to the concentration of the mind and everything. But I was surprised about just how many accidents were happening in what I call a low arousal state, i.e. people are just sort of thinking, oh, I can relax now, sort of there's nothing to worry about, and boom, something happens. That was something quite interesting. There's always any accident that happens. There are always links in the chain. There are always ways in which the accident should have been, the cause of the accident could have been intercepted before it happened through links in the chain. There's a build-up, and then it happens. But that's a subject of much more detailed lectures. And so we used to work hard at that. And I, for example, had a psychologist on my staff. And in fact, he wasn't on my staff, but he worked closely with me. But any accident that took place, we would deploy the psychologist to speak with people to sort of find out sort of the human side as to why things happened. And he was an exceptionally useful person to me to sort of get an insight into the mind of people who'd had the accident. And behind the scene, like I said, links in the chain. I'll give you one example. Not one example, it's just an example. There are probably numerous examples of this where people are distracted for whatever reason, whether it's problems in their home life or problems elsewhere or whatever. But distraction can be a sort of major cause of accidents. That's just one example. I'm not going to get into detail now. But things did concern me a little bit in some areas. Firstly, at the time that I was the RAF Inspector of Flight Safety, I felt I could see that people around the Air Force were not reporting incidents that were happening. They were reporting incidents, but many incidents were not being reported. And this was because there was what I call a bit of a blame culture at the time. And it's quite natural. If somebody thinks they're going to get blamed, then unless they have to report it, they probably won't report it, and that was happening. So the first thing, we had to sort of get away from this blame culture, and that is something we did achieve. We introduced an honest and open reporting scheme, and concentrated very, very strongly on creating a better environment for reporting. And that includes sort of getting those in power to understand the need for a different system as well. I think we made major progress in that area. This also relates to the investigation of aircraft accidents. When an aircraft accident happened, and I saw this because my staff didn't do the investigation of the accidents, but we did provide advisors to advise the boards of inquiry convened to look into accidents. But the trouble with boards of inquiry at the time was that, from my perception, was that 70% of the effort behind carrying out boards of inquiry was concentrating on the subject of blame. You've already heard me mention the word blame. And I felt that's all wrong. You've had an accident, you want to find the cause of the accident. You don't want to sort of spend all your time sort of trying to find somebody to hang. And it really concerned me. And I wrote put a case up to the powers that be, and I said we've got to have a review of board of inquiry procedures. It just so happened to me at the time that the Army at my level was sort of doing exactly the same thing, and so it was rife. And they were convinced to have a review of board of inquiry procedures, which followed. And out of that, I was actually delighted. The recommendation was that board of inquiry procedures should not consider blame as part of the accident. The board of inquiry should investigate the accident, and if there's any blame there, or a disciplinary or legal thing, a disciplinary thing to be dealt with, then that would be a subject of a completely different inquiry, which was a legal inquiry. So we got totally away from this blame culture, and that made a big difference, which is there to this day. And I know from my time in the Air Force just how much damage a blame culture can do. So that was a fascinating 3.5 years in that job, and indeed I was offered the opportunity to go on for longer, but I thought that because I've been there a long time, that a new face is always good value, and so I sort of decided to move on to another job to do with Eurofighter, in fact, which I was quite keen on, and my successors took over. But my interest in aviation safety really sort of was there. It had been there before, it was there even more so now, and it is still there to this day. I'm absolutely fascinated by aviation safety. I have had a deep involvement with aviation safety ever since then and before then, particularly through my involvement with air displays. That's the main area where I'm involved with aviation safety today. But for 6 years, I was also chairman of the General Aviation Safety Council, which was absolutely fascinating. I didn't realise, for example, on my council in the General Aviation Safety Council, there was something like sort of 35, 40 different aspects of general aviation there, all of whom had an interest in aviation safety, whether it was aerobatic pilots or whether it was parachutists or hang gliders or whatever. They were all there, they all had an interest and all had their part to play. And to be quite frank, there were far too many accidents happening in the general aviation world, which shouldn't have happened. And if I'm quite honest, I still think the accident rate in the general aviation world is too high in my view. And to me, it all comes back to training in the first place. Yes, you're going to sort of suffer sort of technical malfunctions and things like that. For example, if you have an engine failure after takeoff, you've got to know what to do. And if you don't have the experience of knowing what to do, well, you've been taught what to do, but if you just freeze when you have the engine failure, then you're probably going to end up stalling the aircraft and the aircraft's going to crash. Whereas if you've been taught and you've thought about sort of what to do, you can set up that aircraft into a glide and sort of find a place to sort of put it on the ground, force land it or whatever. What I'm saying is that in my view, over the years, far too many aircraft have been lost, general aviation aircraft now, because in particular through stalling, when an accident could have been avoided. So, and I still think there's a lot of work to be done on the general aviation side at the moment. Actually, there's a lot of work to be done in all areas. We never lose our concentration on the importance of aviation safety. Technology is moving on all the time. And with technology is protecting us from having accidents, very much so. But technology can also bite you on occasions as well. So you've got to sort of you've got to understand what you're working with and what technology is giving you. Whilst aviation safety has come a long, long way, and the overall accident rate across the board, which I've already said the general aviation side I still think is a bit high, actually I still think that a zero accident rate is capable anywhere. It might not be yet sort of possible 100% of the time, but to me, you've got to aim for a zero accident rate, because the loss of one life is the loss of one life too many. Thank you.